The quiet town of Brookhaven was a place where time seemed to linger. Nestled among gentle hills and serene rivers, it was the kind of community where neighbors waved hello from their porches, and the highlight of the week was the Saturday farmers market. Yet beneath its picturesque charm, Brookhaven carried unspoken tensions, the kind that simmered just beneath the surface, waiting for a moment to erupt. Ella Carter was a woman of great influence, not only because of her poised presence, but because of her role as Brookhaven's mayor. Having grown up in the town, Ella had dedicated her life to its betterment. Her career was marked by relentless advocacy for justice and fairness, standing firmly for those who felt overlooked. But on this warm summer morning, as she tied the laces on her running shoes and prepared for her daily jog, she had no inkling that this day would alter both her life and the course of the town's history. Ella found her morning runs therapeutic, a time to collect her thoughts, plan the day ahead, and occasionally greet familiar faces along the way. Today, her mind was focused on an upcoming meeting with local business owners to discuss improvements to the town square. As she jogged along the well-worn streets, she envisioned strategies to make Brookhaven more inclusive and efficient. The sun cast long shadows over the quiet streets as she approached a small intersection. She noticed the light was green as she crossed, her thoughts preoccupied with solutions for better pedestrian access in the square. Then, without warning, the shrill sound of a police siren pierced the morning calm. Ella stopped in her tracks, her pulse quickening. Though she was no stranger to police sirens, given her role as mayor and her commitment to accountability in law enforcement, this one felt different. The screech of the car pulling up behind her sent a cold unease rippling through her. "Hey, you there! Stop!" The command rang out, sharp and unyielding. Ella slowed her pace and turned to see a white police officer stepping out of his squad car, his hand resting on the handle of his holstered weapon. His piercing gaze swept over her, assessing her with an intensity that felt more like suspicion than duty. Confused but composed, Ella removed her earbuds and addressed him calmly. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was firm but courteous, carrying the same authoritative tone she used in council meetings. "You crossed against the light back there," the officer barked, his tone accusatory. "I'm going to need to see some identification." Ella blinked, momentarily startled. She was certain she hadn't violated any traffic laws. She was meticulous about observing signals during her runs, and the light had been green when she crossed. Surely this was a misunderstanding. "I'm fairly certain I had the right of way," she replied, maintaining her composure. "If there's been any confusion, I'm happy to clarify. I'm on my way to a meeting, officer." "I don't care where you're going," he interrupted, his tone growing harsher. "I said I need to see some ID. Now." A knot of unease tightened in Ella's chest. This wasn't a simple request. It felt like a challenge. The officer's tone and the way his gaze lingered made it clear this was about more than a supposed jaywalking incident. Ella had faced subtle biases before, but this was different, blatant and unnerving. Still, she refused to back down. Straightening her shoulders, she responded, "Officer, I'm Mayor Ella Carter. If you check your records, you'll see I haven't broken any laws. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have important matters to attend to." The officer's eyes narrowed, his expression a mix of disbelief and anger. "Mayor?" he sneered, taking a step closer. "I don't care who you think you are. Nobody is above the law. Now either you show me some ID or I'll take you in for resisting an officer." By now, a small crowd had started to gather, their morning routines disrupted by the scene unfolding in the heart of Brookhaven. People whispered in hushed tones, their curiosity and disbelief palpable. Some pulled out their phones, recording the confrontation between the town's respected mayor and a police officer whose authority seemed fueled by something far more personal than duty. Ella felt their eyes on her. The mix of confusion, support, and quiet outrage from those who recognized her, mingled with curiosity from newcomers and visitors. But the officer whose name tag read Officer Harding appeared completely oblivious to the growing crowd. His focus was solely on asserting control, as though the badge on his chest made him untouchable. "I am the law here," Harding said coldly, reaching for his handcuffs, "and right now, you're under arrest." Ella felt a wave of fury surge through her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. The absurdity of the situation was almost too much to bear. She was the mayor of Brookhaven, a woman who had spent her career championing justice and equality, and yet here she was, treated like a common criminal for no legitimate reason. Not for breaking any law, but for being a black woman who refused to bow to the prejudice radiating from this officer. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever faced unjust treatment, about every moment of quiet humiliation that people of color endure daily. "I'm not going anywhere," Ella said, her voice firm and unwavering. She stood her ground, her gaze locked with Harding's. "And I won't let you humiliate me, or anyone else in this town because of your bias." Harding's expression darkened, his grip tightening on the handcuffs in his hand. "You can either come quietly," he growled, "or I'll make you." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone shouted, "She's the mayor! You can't do this." But Harding wasn't listening. His world had narrowed to his badge, his authority, and the belief that he had the power to act without question. Ella's heart pounded as she felt the cold metal of the cuffs snap around her wrists. The once peaceful morning had spiraled into chaos, and the tension in the air was almost unbearable. The injustice of it all burned in her chest, a searing reminder of how much work still needed to be done. As the cameras continued to roll and the crowd grew larger, Ella realized this moment wasn't just about her anymore. It was the spark of something bigger, a fight for dignity, for justice, for the soul of Brookhaven itself. The metallic clink of the handcuffs reverberated through the street, an ominous sound that silenced even the most vocal in the crowd. Ella Carter, her wrists bound behind her back, refused to bow her head. Her defiance was clear, even as Officer Harding pushed her toward his squad car, a smug grin plastered across his face. Harding seemed immune to the murmurs of the onlookers, indifferent to the disgusted stares and the raised phones capturing every second. But Ella knew this wasn't an ordinary arrest. This moment carried the weight of years of unspoken tensions in Brookhaven, racial, social, and economic divides that had been ignored for far too long. The crowd swelled, their reactions ranging from horror to disbelief. Some stood frozen, while others whispered among themselves. Many continued to film, their footage already making its way to social media. "What's going on?" a man in his 40s asked as he pushed to the front. "That's the mayor. You can't do this." But Harding was unmoved. He seemed lost in the power he believed his uniform gave him, deaf to reason and blind to the consequences. To him, Ella Carter's title, her contributions to the town, and her standing in the community were irrelevant. In his eyes, she was just another black woman who had dared to stand up to him. Ella's pulse raced, but she refused to let fear or anger consume her. She stood tall, even as the handcuffs bit into her wrists, her presence a silent statement of resistance. She knew this was only the beginning of something much larger. A fight for accountability in a system that had failed so many for so long. As the squad car door loomed ahead, Ella caught the eyes of the crowd around her. In their faces, she saw anger, sadness, and determination. The town had been quiet for too long. Today, that silence was broken. Ella felt the weight of their support behind her, but she also understood the stakes. The wrong move, a flash of temper, could escalate the situation into something far worse. She had faced adversity before, endured countless challenges as a black woman in leadership, but this was unlike anything she had experienced. Humiliation burned in her chest, but her resolve remained unshaken. She stood tall, her voice calm but firm. "Officer Harding," she began, steadying herself even as adrenaline coursed through her veins. "This is a mistake. You know who I am. Let me go and we can resolve this peacefully. There's no need to make a scene." Harding's jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed into icy slits. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job, lady," he snapped. "Just because you're the mayor doesn't mean you're above the law. You broke it, and now you're going to pay the price." Ella knew reasoning with him was futile. His mind was already made up. She recognized the stubborn defiance in his expression, one she had seen countless times, whether in contentious meetings with council members or dealings with developers resistant to change. But this wasn't about policy or negotiations. It was about survival. She raised her chin, meeting his gaze head-on. "Then arrest me," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. But understand this, when the truth comes out, and it will, you'll be the one answering for it, not me." Her words hung in the air, heavy and electric, like a storm about to break. The crowd murmured in agreement, their whispers growing louder, bolder. More people pushed to the front, demanding answers and shouting accusations of abuse of power. For the first time, Harding's smug demeanor faltered. His smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of unease as he glanced at the crowd. He hadn't expected this level of resistance. The weight of so many eyes on him seemed to shake his confidence, but instead of backing down, he clung stubbornly to his authority. His grip on Ella's arm tightened, and he began shoving her toward the squad car with a force that belied his growing desperation. "You all need to disperse," Harding yelled, his voice carrying a hint of panic. "Anyone who interferes will be arrested." A young woman near the front of the crowd shot back. "For what? Standing up for our mayor? You're the one breaking the law." Her words ignited a chorus of agreement, the crowd's voices rising together like a tidal wave, crashing against Harding's fragile facade of control. Ella could feel the energy shifting. The anger in the air was palpable, and it wasn't aimed at her. It was aimed squarely at Harding. She saw it in his eyes, the dawning realization that he had made a grave mistake. But rather than admit it, he doubled down, his voice shaking slightly as he sneered. "You think I'm afraid of a crowd? You people need to learn how the law works, and if I have to teach you, then so be it." The phrase "you people" sent another ripple of outrage through the crowd. Ella clenched her fists, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into her skin. Still, she refused to let her emotions take over. Now wasn't the time for anger, it was time for strategy. And then from the back of the crowd, a firm voice broke through the chaos. "Harding, what the hell are you doing?" The crowd parted slightly, revealing another police officer making his way forward. Officer Robert Harris, one of the few officers in Brookhaven whom Ella respected, pushed through the throng. His expression was a mix of concern and disbelief as he assessed the scene. Harris was known for his level-headedness and his genuine connection to the community. His presence brought a flicker of hope to Ella's chest. Harding stiffened, his face flushing. "I've got this under control, Harris," he said, though his voice lacked its previous conviction. "She broke the law, resisted, and now she's under arrest." Harris stopped in front of Harding, his gaze sharp. "She's the mayor, Harding. You know that. What law could she possibly have broken?" Harding's grip faltered for a moment, but he doubled down again. "She was crossing against the light. She resisted when I asked for ID." Harry's eyes narrowed, his voice calm but firm. "Harding, you're arresting the mayor of Brookhaven in front of half the town. Take a step back and think about what you're doing." Ella watched the exchange, a glimmer of hope cutting through her frustration. Harry's wasn't here to back her up as a favor. He was here because he knew what was happening wasn't right. She could see Harding's confidence starting to crack under the weight of Harry's presence and the crowd's mounting outrage. The tension in the air felt like it might snap at any moment. Harding's grip on Ella's arm tightened, his knuckles going white. His defiance burned brightly, fueled by pride and prejudice. "I'm not letting her go," Harding growled. "I have every right to arrest her, and I'm doing it." Harry stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "Think about what you're doing. You're arresting the mayor of Brookhaven in front of half the town, and on baseless charges. This is going to blow up in your face, and you know it." Ella watched the exchange, her emotions a storm of hope and unease. Harry's was trying to defuse the situation, but Harding's stubbornness was palpable. Every word from the crowd, shouts of support for Ella, accusations against Harding seemed to push him further into his misguided sense of authority. "Back off, Harry's," Harding barked, his voice rising again. "I said I've got this." "No, you don't," Harry's replied, stepping even closer until he was almost nose to nose with Harding. "You're about to make the biggest mistake of your career. Let her go." The air seemed to still for a moment as the two officers stared each other down. The crowd had gone quiet, every set of eyes locked on the tense standoff. Ella's heart raced as she studied Harding's face, watching the internal struggle play out, the battle between his need to assert dominance and the dawning realization that he was losing control. Then, as though a switch had flipped, Harding shoved Ella roughly toward Harry's. Fine, he spat, his voice dripping with venom. Take her. But don't think this is over. Harry's caught Ella, steadying her as she stumbled slightly. You okay, Mayor? He asked softly, his eyes filled with genuine concern. Ella nodded, though her wrists ached from the tight handcuffs. I'm fine, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil still roiling inside her. The humiliation, the anger, it was all still there, but she wasn't going to let it show. Harry's quickly unlocked the cuffs, and as the metal fell away, the crowd erupted. Applause and cheers echoed through the street, the sound rising like a wave. People began chanting her name, their voices filled with solidarity and defiance. Harding, looking both defeated and furious, stalked back to his squad car, his face a mask of frustration. The smugness that had fueled him moments earlier was gone, replaced by a simmering resentment. Ella stood tall. Even as her hands trembled slightly from the adrenaline, she could feel the energy of the crowd surging around her, a tide of support and anger at the injustice they had just witnessed. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Brookhaven. It was about standing up against the systemic issues that allowed officers like Harding to abuse their power unchecked. As the crowd surged forward to greet her, offering words of support and comfort, Ella realized that this moment was the beginning of something much larger. Brookhaven had been silent for too long, and today, that silence had been shattered. When the crowd finally began to disperse, the energy of the moment lingered. Conversations buzzed through the street, phones continued recording, and tension hung in the air like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. Harry's, who had stayed by Ella's side as the crowd thinned, looked at her with unspoken words in his eyes. He didn't need to say anything for Ella to understand the gravity of what had just happened. The immediate danger had passed, but the real challenge was only beginning. Ella walked away from the scene, her shoulders squared, despite the weight pressing down on her chest. The events of that morning were just the spark. Brookhaven was changing before her eyes, and this moment, this unjust, humiliating arrest, had struck a nerve in the community. People wouldn't forget what they had witnessed, and neither would Ella. Walking through the familiar streets of Brookhaven, Ella Carter could feel the shift in the town's atmosphere. Every corner, every shop front, every passerby seemed to carry an unspoken awareness of what had transpired earlier that morning. Faces she had known for years looked at her differently now, some with admiration, others with a silent question. What happens next? The incident wasn't just a personal ordeal. It was the beginning of something far larger, something that would shake Brookhaven's long-standing status quo. But for Ella, the immediate concern wasn't just how the town would respond, it was her next move. As mayor, her responsibilities didn't pause for personal crises, and a meeting with the business council loomed less than an hour away. Yet the weight of the morning's events pressed heavily on her mind. She decided to stop by a small cafe she frequented, hoping for a moment of quiet to gather her thoughts. Inside, the usual hum of activity filled the space. Diners chatting over coffee, baristas calling out orders, but even here, the air felt different. Heads turned as she entered, conversations hushed, and a sense of unease settled over the room. Behind the counter, a young barista named Simone gave her a knowing nod. Simone, a black woman who had worked at the cafe since high school, was someone Ella had always admired for her optimism and resilience, despite the challenges she faced in a town like Brookhaven. Mayor Carter, Simone said softly as Ella approached the counter. I saw what happened. Are you okay? Ella managed a small, tired smile. I'm fine, Simone. Just a bit shaken. How about you? How are you holding up? Simone's expression flickered with uncertainty, as if debating how much to say. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. I've been there. Not on that scale, but I've had my run-ins. It's hard to be seen, you know? Ella nodded slowly. She did know. The subtle slights, the quiet biases, the dismissive looks from people like Harding, she had endured them her entire life. But today's events had crossed a line even she hadn't expected. You handled it with so much grace, Simone continued. I don't know if I could have stayed that calm. People are already talking about it, you know? They're calling you a hero. Ella's stomach twisted at the word. She didn't feel like a hero. Heroes were firefighters running into burning buildings or doctors saving lives in impossible circumstances. All she had done was refuse to let Harding strip her of her dignity. But even as she doubted the label, she couldn't deny that something important had shifted in Brookhaven that day. As Simone handed over Ella's usual order, Ella's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen to find a flood of messages and missed calls. The city council, her staff, reporters, her phone had been blowing up for the past hour. Clips of her arrest were spreading like wildfire across social media, accompanied by headlines like, "Mayor Ella Carter arrested. Was it racial profiling?" and "Brookhaven's police under fire after mayor's arrest." The world beyond Brookhaven had taken notice, and with that came a new level of scrutiny, not just for Ella, but for the entire town. Her quiet life as the mayor of a small, tight-knit community was over, at least for now. The question wasn't just how she would handle it, but how she would ensure that such an injustice never happened again, to her or to anyone else. Stepping outside with her coffee, Ella let the crisp air clear her thoughts. Her mind raced, weighing her next steps. Part of her wanted to march straight to City Hall, call an emergency meeting, and address the issue head-on. But she knew better. This was bigger than Officer Harding. It was about the deeply rooted systems that had allowed someone like him to feel emboldened in the first place. Addressing the problem meant challenging not just the police department, but the entire power structure of Brookhaven, a structure that had been festering with unacknowledged prejudice for years. Ella took a deep breath. This wasn't just a fight for her dignity, it was a fight for the soul of her town. And it was only the beginning. Ella Carter's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from her chief of staff, Helen. She hesitated, already knowing what Helen was going to say. Damage control. Carefully crafted statements, efforts to manage the fallout. But Ella wasn't in the mood for political maneuvering. She wanted real change. Taking a steadying breath, she answered. "Helen," Ella greeted, trying to sound composed. "What's the situation?" "We've got a problem," Helen replied, her voice tight with tension. "The media is all over this, and the council is panicking. They're demanding we issue a statement, something that downplays the incident before it spirals out of control." Ella's grip on her phone tightened. "Downplay?" she repeated, her tone laced with disbelief. "How am I supposed to downplay what just happened? This isn't some minor misunderstanding, Helen. It's serious. People are angry, and they should be." "I know," Helen said carefully, "but you need to tread lightly. If you push too hard, you'll risk alienating the council, and some of them are already looking for ways to distance themselves. We can't afford a divided administration." Ella closed her eyes for a moment, her frustration building. She understood the political calculus, but sweeping the issue under the rug wasn't an option. "Helen, I understand the stakes," she said firmly, "but if we downplay this, we're telling the people of Brookhaven that their anger isn't valid, that their concerns don't matter. I can't do that. I won't do that." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Helen sighed, a sound of reluctant resignation. "All right," she said finally. "But you know, this is going to be a fight, right? Are you ready for that?" Ella glanced out at the streets of Brookhaven, at the people going about their day, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. "I've been fighting my whole life," she replied. "I'm not about to stop now." She ended the call and made her way toward City Hall, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. Her phone continued to buzz with calls and messages, reporters, council members, supporters, but she ignored most of them. Her focus was on the task ahead. When she stepped into City Hall, the change in atmosphere was palpable. The usual hum of activity was subdued, replaced with a tense quiet. Staff members moved with purpose, but their glances carried unease. Helen was waiting for her by the entrance, clipboard in hand and worry etched across her face. "I've already set up a press conference," Helen said, falling into step beside Ella. "The media is outside and they're hungry for a statement. I know you want to address this head-on, but please, Ella, be careful. You know how easily things can be twisted." Ella gave a small nod. "I'll be careful, Helen, but I'm not holding back." As they approached the council chambers, Ella could hear the low murmur of voices inside. The council members were gathered, their tones hushed and apprehensive. When she entered, all eyes turned to her, their expressions a mix of relief and unease. "Mayor Carter," said Alex Brenner, one of the longest-serving council members. He stood awkwardly, wringing his hands. We've been discussing the situation, and we think it would be best to issue a joint statement, something that reassures the public this was all just a misunderstanding. Ella raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor masking her disbelief. A misunderstanding? She asked evenly. Alex, I was arrested in broad daylight for no reason. That's not a misunderstanding, that's a problem. Alex shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. I'm not saying it wasn't mishandled, he said. But we need to be careful about how we frame this. The police department is already feeling the heat, and the last thing we want is to incite more division in the town. Ella's eyes narrowed, her voice steady but sharp. This isn't about avoiding division, Alex. It's about addressing it. There's a real problem here, and if we don't confront it, it's only going to get worse. Her words hung in the air, the weight of them silencing the room. Ella could see the discomfort on the faces of some council members, their unwillingness to acknowledge the depth of the issue. But she could also sense a shift, however small, in others, a recognition that ignoring this wasn't an option. Alex opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to falter. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Ella knew she was walking a fine line, but she also knew the stakes were too high to tiptoe around the truth. Brookhaven is watching us, she continued, and they're waiting to see if we'll do the right thing. This isn't just about me, it's about everyone in this town who's ever felt unseen, unheard, or unsafe. We can't afford to let them down. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, reluctantly, Alex nodded, though his expression remained guarded. All right, he said quietly. But we need to handle this carefully, Mayor. The entire town's watching, and this could go either way. Ella met his gaze, unflinching. It's already gone one way, Alex. Now it's up to us to change that. Ella Carter scanned the room, the council's faces reflecting a mix of discomfort and fear. It wasn't the fear of failure, but of change, the fear of confronting long-ignored truths. But Ella wasn't afraid. Not anymore. This isn't just about one officer making a mistake, Ella said, her voice resolute and unwavering. This is about a system that empowers people like Officer Harding to feel untouchable. It's about the way this town treats its residents of color, and I won't stay silent about it any longer. In the corner, Helen watched intently, her expression a mixture of pride and worry. Ella understood the stakes of speaking so boldly, but the time for caution was over. Silence had enabled the injustices to persist, and Ella was determined to break that cycle. As her words hung in the air, the door to the council chambers creaked open, and one of her aides entered. Mayor Carter, the press is ready for you. Ella nodded, straightening her blazer. The weight of the moment pressed on her. But it wasn't about her alone. It was for everyone in Brookhaven who had ever felt powerless or wronged. With Helen at her side and the council watching her every move, Ella stepped out of the chamber and into the storm. The press conference was staged on the grand steps of Brookhaven City Hall. The building, with its stately brick facade and towering columns, had long symbolized the town's quiet resilience. But today, the air was heavy with tension. A crowd had gathered, far larger than Ella had anticipated. Residents, activists, community leaders, and journalists stood shoulder to shoulder, their cameras and microphones poised to catch every word. Ella positioned herself behind the podium, gripping its edges tightly as she surveyed the sea of faces. The moment felt surreal. Years of unspoken tensions in Brookhaven had come to a head, catalyzed by the viral footage of her arrest. Overnight, the story had spread beyond the town, reaching national news outlets. Now, every eye in the crowd was locked on her, waiting to hear what she had to say, waiting for her to lead. Behind her, the city council sat stiffly, their unease plain. They had held a last-minute meeting before the conference, urging Ella to soften her message to avoid further inflaming the situation. But she had refused. This wasn't a time for watered-down platitudes. It was a time for truth. Helen stood quietly at her side, a steady presence in the chaos. Ella could sense her chief of staff's worry, but also her unwavering belief that this moment mattered. Both women knew there would be fallout, but they also understood the importance of courage in the face of fear. Taking a deep breath, Ella stepped up to the microphone. The crowd fell silent, the tension palpable. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised and cameras zooming in. For a brief moment, The chaos of the past 24 hours seemed to dissolve. It was just Ella and the people she served. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady but weighted with emotion. "I stand before you today not just as your mayor, but as a resident of Brookhaven, as someone who loves this town and all that it stands for." She paused, letting the words settle. "Yesterday, I was unlawfully detained by one of our police officers. I was handcuffed, humiliated, and treated like a criminal for simply crossing the street on my way to work. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a mistake. This was an act of racial profiling, plain and simple." The crowd stirred, murmurs rippling through the throng. Some nodded in agreement, their expressions resolute, while others looked shocked. The truth, spoken so plainly, had landed like a thunderclap. "For far too long," Ella continued, "we have allowed a culture of bias and discrimination to take root in our institutions. This isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that perpetuates inequality, a system that fails to hold its own accountable." She could feel the shift in the crowd as her words sunk in. This wasn't just a speech, it was a call to action. Ella's voice grew stronger as she pressed on. "Brookhaven is a town built on community and resilience, but we cannot claim to be a strong community while ignoring the injustices that occur in our midst. This moment is about more than my experience. It's about all of us. It's about ensuring that no one in our town ever feels powerless or unheard again." The reporters scrambled to capture her every word as the crowd hung on to her every syllable. Ella wasn't just addressing the immediate issue. She was laying the groundwork for a broader reckoning, a chance for Brookhaven to confront its flaws and forge a new path forward. "This is about a system that has failed its citizens," Ella Carter said, her voice ringing with conviction, "particularly our black and brown neighbors, again and again, and I will not stand by and let it continue." With each word, Ella's voice grew stronger, her resolve deepening as she felt the crowd's energy shift. She had prepared for moments like this her entire life, even if she hadn't realized it until now. Every battle, every injustice she had endured had led her to this point. "As your mayor," she continued, "I have worked tirelessly to build bridges in this community, to create opportunities for every resident. But yesterday made it clear to me that we have far more work to do. And that work starts today." Ella's eyes scanned the faces in the crowd. Some were filled with hope, others with cautious skepticism. There were still those who clung to the belief that Brookhaven was immune to such issues, that racial bias was a problem confined to other places. But the events of the previous day had shattered that illusion. The video of her arrest, the images of her in handcuffs, had forced the truth into the open, a truth many had ignored for far too long. "I am calling for an immediate investigation," Ella declared, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "An independent, transparent, and thorough investigation into the actions of Officer Harding and the Brookhaven Police Department, and we will not stop until justice is served." A wave of whispers rippled through the crowd, a mixture of agreement and surprise. Ella knew this was a bold demand. Calling for an independent investigation wasn't a small ask, it was a direct challenge to the entrenched systems of power that had governed Brookhaven for decades. But she also knew it was necessary. Without accountability, trust could never be rebuilt. Behind her, Ella could feel the unease radiating from the city council. Some of them had been reluctant to support such a drastic measure, fearing the backlash. But Ella had made it clear. If they wanted to be remembered for standing on the right side of history, they would have to back her. "This investigation," she continued, "is only the first step. We need comprehensive reforms in our police department. We need to address the systemic issues that have allowed officers like Harding to act without consequence. And we need to rebuild the trust between our community and law enforcement." The crowd grew silent, their attention locked on her every word. Ella could sense the gravity of the moment settling over them. This wasn't just about her arrest, it was about years of quiet discrimination, unspoken bias, and injustices that had been swept under the rug. And now, for the first time, the town had an opportunity to face those truths head-on. "I know that change isn't easy," Ella said, her tone softening slightly. "I know that for many of you, this moment feels uncomfortable, even frightening. But we cannot let fear hold us back from doing what is right. Brookhaven deserves better. We deserve better. We deserve a future where every person, no matter their race, is treated with dignity and respect. The reporters scribbled furiously, their cameras flashing as Ella stood tall. She wasn't simply advocating for reform, she was calling for a reckoning. A chance for the town to confront its past and reshape its future. I am not just fighting for myself, Ella continued, her voice gaining strength once more. I am fighting for every person in this town who has ever been treated unfairly, for every person who has ever felt invisible or unheard. This is our moment, to stand together, to fight against injustice, and to make Brookhaven a place where equality and justice truly mean something. A beat of silence followed, Ella's words hanging in the air like a challenge to everyone present. Then, slowly, a smattering of applause began, soft at first but growing steadily. Within moments, the entire square erupted into cheers, the sound building like a wave. People clapped and chanted her name, their voices rising in unity. Ella's heart swelled as she looked out over the crowd. This was the Brookhaven she believed in, the town she had fought so hard to lead. In this moment she could see its potential, a glimpse of the community it could become. Standing there, with the sunlight casting long shadows over the square, Ella knew the road ahead would not be easy. Change never was. But as she gazed at the faces of her neighbors, filled with determination and hope, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about building something better. And Ella Carter was ready to lead the charge. Ella Carter stood on the steps of Brookhaven City Hall as the applause began to wane. The cheers and chants from the crowd still reverberated in her ears, but she knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be backlash. There always was. Those in positions of power, especially those who benefited from the status quo, would resist the changes she was calling for. There would be tense conversations, heated confrontations, and moments of doubt. But Ella was resolute. There was no going back. As the applause died down, a reporter raised his hand. Mayor Carter, do you believe Officer Harding will be held accountable for his actions? And how do you respond to claims that this was an isolated incident? Ella met the reporter's gaze, her expression unwavering. If we are truly committed to justice, she said, her voice firm, then yes, Officer Harding will be held accountable. But let me be clear, this is not an isolated incident. This is part of a larger pattern, not just in Brookhaven, but across the country. And it's time we confront it head-on. Another reporter quickly jumped in. What do you say to those who think you're overreacting? That this is being blown out of proportion? Ella paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. I would say that they should try walking in my shoes, she said, her tone steady but charged with emotion. Try being arrested on your way to work, not because of something you did, but because of who you are. Then tell me if it's being blown out of proportion. This isn't about overreacting, it's about standing up for what's right. The crowd erupted into cheers once again, and Ella felt a swell of pride rise in her chest. This was more than a moment for her. It was a moment of truth for the entire town. And though the path forward would be fraught with challenges, she felt a deep certainty that she wasn't facing it alone. As the press conference came to a close, the crowd began to disperse slowly, the square still buzzing with energy. Reporters lingered, firing off follow-up questions, but Ella stepped away. She had said what needed to be said. Now it was time for action. Helen caught up with her as she headed back inside City Hall. Her chief of staff's eyes were wide with admiration. Ella, that was incredible, Helen said. You really nailed it. Ella smiled faintly, the weight of the moment still heavy on her shoulders. Thanks, Helen, she said. But this is just the beginning. Helen nodded. I know, but you've already taken the hardest step. Ella looked back at the now empty square. Just minutes ago, it had been filled with hundreds of people standing together in solidarity. Let's hope the town is ready for the steps to come, she said. Inside City Hall, the atmosphere was charged with tension. The city council was already gathered in the conference room, their expressions ranging from anxious to outright resistant. Ella straightened her shoulders, ready for what was to come. There was no time to dwell on the past. Brookhaven was about to change, and she was determined to lead that change, no matter the cost. As she entered the room, The murmured conversation died down. All eyes turned to her. Alex Brenner, one of the longest-serving and most conservative members of the council, was the first to speak. "Well, Mayor," Alex began, his tone measured but tinged with frustration, "that was quite the show out there." Ella met his gaze evenly, her expression unflinching. She had expected resistance, especially from Alex. Change was never easy, and in Brookhaven, power was held tightly by those with no interest in disrupting the status quo. "It wasn't a show," Ella replied, her voice steady. "It was the truth, and it's time we face it." Alex leaned back in his chair, his lips pressed into a thin line. "No one's saying we shouldn't address the issue," he said carefully, "but there's a way to do this without tearing the town apart. We need to be cautious, measured. Rushing into things could create more problems than it solves." Ella felt a spark of frustration, but kept her composure. "Caution is what got us here, Alex. For years, this town has ignored the issues that have festered under the surface. Yesterday made it clear. We can't afford to ignore them any longer." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Ella scanned the faces of the council members. Some, like Alex, looked uneasy, their reluctance to change written plainly on their faces. But others seemed to be considering her words, the seeds of understanding, beginning to take root. "The people of Brookhaven are watching us," Ella continued. "They're looking to us for leadership, for accountability, for justice. If we don't act now, we're telling them that their voices don't matter. And I refuse to do that." The council exchanged glances, the room filled with an unspoken tension. Ella knew this was just the first of many battles to come. But she also knew it was a fight worth having. Brookhaven deserved better, and she would stop at nothing to ensure that it got it. "You certainly made quite a statement out there today," said Alex Walters, his tone measured but laced with frustration. Ella Carter took her seat at the head of the table, her back straight and her gaze unflinching. The tension in the room was palpable, a thick, unyielding presence that hung over the council chamber. But Ella was prepared for this. This was where the real work began. "I said what needed to be said, Alex," she replied, her voice calm but resolute. "We can't keep pretending that what happened yesterday was an isolated incident. The people of Brookhaven deserve accountability, and they deserve a police force that serves all of them, not just some." Alex exchanged uneasy glances with a few of his colleagues, a silent communication that spoke volumes. They weren't going to make this easy for her. "Look," Alex said, leaning forward slightly, "I'm not saying we shouldn't address the issue, but calling for an independent investigation? That's a pretty drastic step. We already have protocols in place for handling situations like this. Let the internal review process play out." Ella had expected this argument. It was one she had heard countless times from those who valued appearances over meaningful change. The internal review process, as far as she was concerned, was a farce. It was a way for the police department to investigate itself, often sweeping misconduct under the rug and leaving systemic issues untouched. "We've seen what the internal review process produces, Alex," Ella said, her voice sharpening. "It produces nothing. The people of this town don't trust it, and they have every reason not to. If we're serious about restoring trust, transparency is the only way. An independent investigation is our only option." Alex shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly unused to being challenged so directly. Ella had always been known for her diplomacy, but this wasn't a time for half measures. "I understand that emotions are running high right now," Alex said defensively, his tone growing more strained. "But we have to think about the long-term consequences. An independent investigation could drag on for months, even years. It could tie up resources we don't have. And what if it turns out to be inconclusive? Then what?" Ella met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "What happens if we do nothing, Alex?" she countered. "What happens if we let this moment slip by without taking real action? The people of Brookhaven are demanding change, and if we don't give it to them, they'll find someone who will. And I'm not just talking about the next election. I'm talking about protests, boycotts, unrest. We've already seen the beginnings of it today." The room fell silent, her words hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. Ella wasn't exaggerating. Since her arrest, the energy in the town had shifted dramatically. There was a growing sense of anger and frustration, particularly among Brookhaven's black and brown residents, who had long felt marginalized and ignored. The videos of her arrest had ignited a fire that couldn't be contained. Alex opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, another voice cut through the tension. "I think the mayor is right," said Linda Chavez, a relatively new council member and one of the few people of color in Brookhaven's local government. Ella turned to Linda, gratitude flickering across her face. Linda, who had been elected just a year ago on a platform of reform, had quickly earned a reputation as a thoughtful and determined leader. She often took a cautious approach, preferring to build consensus before pushing for change. But today, it seemed, Linda was ready to fight. "What happened to Mayor Carter is a reflection of something much bigger," Linda continued, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "This isn't just about one incident or one officer. It's about a system that has allowed these kinds of injustices to happen over and over again. If we don't act now, we're complicit in that system." The room shifted slightly, the weight of Linda's words pressing down on everyone present. Ella watched as Alex leaned back in his chair, his lips pursed in frustration. He wasn't ready to concede, but the tide in the room was clearly turning. "I know this isn't going to be easy," Linda added, her tone softening but losing none of its power. "But we can't let fear of backlash stop us from doing what's right. The people of this town are watching, and they're counting on us to lead." Ella nodded, her chest swelling with a renewed sense of purpose. Linda's support was unexpected but deeply appreciated. For the first time in the meeting, Ella felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Alex sighed heavily, glancing around the room. "All right," he said finally, his tone begrudging. "But if we're going to do this, we need to be smart about it. We can't afford to get this wrong." "We won't," Ella said firmly. "But we can't afford to wait either." As the meeting continued, Ella felt a shift, not just in the council, but in herself. This wasn't just about addressing what had happened to her. It was about creating lasting change. And though the fight ahead would be long and grueling, she was more determined than ever to see it through. "It's not just about her," Linda Chavez said, her voice steady and impassioned. "It's about everyone in this town who has been stopped, questioned, or harassed simply because of the color of their skin. We can't ignore that anymore. If we do, we're complicit." Alex Walters leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening. "So what are you suggesting, Linda? That we tear the whole system down and start over?" "I'm suggesting we hold people accountable," Linda shot back, her voice unwavering. "And yes, if that means we have to overhaul the system, then that's what we do, because the system isn't working. Not for everyone." The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Ella Carter could feel the widening divide between the council members. On one side were people like Alex, representatives of the old guard who had grown comfortable with the status quo and saw any challenge to it as a threat. On the other were people like Linda who were ready to fight for real change, even if it meant confronting resistance head-on. Ella knew she had to tread carefully. Alienating the more conservative members of the council could stall progress, but she couldn't back down from her position either. It was a delicate balancing act, one that demanded both strength and strategy. "I understand that this is a difficult conversation," Ella said, breaking the tense silence. Her voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the steel behind it. "But it's a conversation we need to have. If we don't address these issues now, they're only going to get worse. We can't afford to wait until it's too late." Alex looked like he wanted to argue further, his jaw tightening, but before he could speak, another voice chimed in. "I think we need to listen to the mayor," said Rachel Lee, one of the more moderate voices on the council. Ella turned to Rachel, relief flickering across her face. "I've been hearing from my constituents all day," Rachel continued, "and they're angry. People are talking about protests, about boycotting businesses. If we don't do something, this is going to blow up in our faces." Alex's face tightened further, but he remained silent. It was clear that the tide in the room was shifting. Ella could see it in the way the council members shifted in their seats, their expressions thoughtful, even hesitant. They knew change was coming, whether they liked it or not. The only question was whether they would embrace it or try to stand in its way. Ella took a deep breath, sensing the moment of decision was near. I'm asking you all to support the independent investigation, she said, her voice calm but firm. I'm not asking for anything radical. I'm asking for transparency, for accountability. If we do this right, we can rebuild trust in our police department and in our local government. But if we don't act, we risk losing that trust forever. The room fell silent. Her words hung in the air, heavy with urgency. Alex looked around the table, his eyes scanning the faces of his colleagues, clearly gauging their mood. But it was obvious the momentum was no longer in his favor. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed and leaned forward, his expression resigned. Fine, he said, his voice grudging. We'll support the investigation, but don't expect us to roll over on everything, Mayor. There's a lot more at stake here than just this one incident. Ella nodded, though her heart was pounding. She had won this round, but she knew Alex was right about one thing: the fight was far from over. The independent investigation was only the beginning. There would be pushback from the police department, from conservative factions in the town, and from those who saw any challenge to the existing power structures as a threat. But Ella was ready. She had spent her life preparing for this fight, and now that it was here, she wasn't going to back down. As the meeting adjourned and the council members began filing out of the room, Ella turned to Linda, who lingered behind. Thank you for speaking up, Ella said, her voice sincere. I couldn't have done it without you. Linda smiled faintly, though her eyes still carried the weight of the conversation they had just endured. You could have, she said, her tone warm but firm. But I'm glad I didn't let you. Ella gave her a small smile in return. For the first time in a long while, she felt the stirrings of hope. Change was never easy, but together, they had taken an important step forward. Linda Chavez smiled, though a hint of exhaustion lingered in her eyes. We're in this together, Ella. But you know this is just the beginning, right? Ella Carter nodded, her expression calm but resolute. I know. But we've taken the first step. That's what matters. Linda's smile widened, even as the weight of the challenges ahead pressed upon her. Then let's make sure we take the next one, too. Ella watched as Linda left the council chamber, her mind already racing ahead to the work that lay before her. The investigation into the Brookhaven Police Department would be grueling, and the backlash would be fierce. Still, for the first time in a long while, Ella felt a spark of hope. The people of Brookhaven were ready for change, and she was ready to lead them toward it. Outside, the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet streets of Brookhaven. But within those shadows, Ella saw something new, a flicker of light, a hint of possibility. The fight for reform had just begun, and the road to justice stretched far ahead. The next few weeks in Brookhaven were nothing short of chaotic. Ella, the steady hand who had led the town with composure for years, found herself at the center of an intense and unrelenting storm. The independent investigation into the police department was officially underway, and the tension in the town was palpable. Everywhere Ella went, she felt the weight of the town's gaze. People whispered her name in hushed tones, debated her actions in coffee shops, and speculated about the investigation's outcome. Inside City Hall, the atmosphere had grown strained. Council meetings, once methodical and orderly, had become battlegrounds. Every decision was scrutinized, every move dissected by those fighting for progress or clinging desperately to the old ways. For Ella, each day was a balancing act, a tightrope walk over a canyon of mistrust and resistance. The weight of Brookhaven's future pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she carried it with determination. The first blow came from the Brookhaven Police Department itself. 2 days after the investigation was announced, Chief Donald Mathers, the long-standing head of the department, held a press conference. Flanked by several officers, including Officer Harding, whose actions had become a symbol of the department's failures, Mathers delivered a fiery and defiant statement. Our officers are under attack, Mathers declared, his voice ringing with indignation. The men and women of the Brookhaven Police Department risk their lives every day to protect this community, and now their integrity is being questioned based on one isolated incident. I stand by my officers. This so-called investigation is nothing more than a political stunt, driven by outside forces seeking to undermine our authority. From her office, Ella watched the press conference, her hands clenched into fists. Mather's words weren't meant to address the issues. They were designed to rally the department and the more conservative residents of Brookhaven, those who still believed the police could do no wrong. What angered Ella most was the chief's refusal to acknowledge the systemic problems that had led to her arrest and countless other incidents that had gone unreported. He spoke as though the investigation was a personal attack, rather than an opportunity for accountability and growth. The sharp ring of her phone pulled Ella out of her thoughts. It was Helen. "Did you see that?" Helen asked, her voice tight with frustration. "I saw it," Ella replied, her jaw set. "He's doubling down. Just like I expected." "They're circling the wagons," Helen said. "Mathers isn't going to let this investigation go without a fight. We're going to need more than public support. We have to get ahead of this before they control the narrative." Ella sighed, leaning back in her chair. She had known this battle would be difficult, but the reality of it was even more exhausting than she had anticipated. The police department wasn't just defending itself, it was actively resisting accountability. And Mathers had powerful allies in Brookhaven who would fight tooth and nail to protect the status quo. The next day, Ella discovered just how far that resistance would go. She was scheduled to meet with a group of local activists who had organized peaceful protests in support of the investigation. The meeting was set to take place at a small community center in the heart of Brookhaven's Black neighborhood, a neighborhood that had long been a hub of activism and resilience. But when Ella arrived, her heart sank. Dozens of officers, including Officer Harding, stood in rigid formation at the entrance, their arms crossed in a display of silent defiance. The air crackled with tension as Ella stepped out of her car, her heart sinking at the sight. The officers refused to acknowledge her approach, their eyes fixed straight ahead. The hostility radiating from them was palpable. A wall of unspoken resistance. "What's going on here?" Ella demanded, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "This is a public meeting. You have no right to block access." Sergeant William, a familiar figure in Brookhaven's police force, stepped forward. His expression was cold and unyielding. "Mayor Carter," he said flatly, "we've been ordered to shut this meeting down. It's a public safety concern." "A public safety concern?" Ella's voice rose, incredulous. "There's no threat here. This is a peaceful meeting with community leaders. We've received credible information that there could be unrest," William replied, his tone devoid of emotion. "We're here to prevent that." Ella's anger flared. She could see exactly what was happening. This wasn't about public safety. It was intimidation, plain and simple. The police were sending a message to her, to the activists, and to the entire town. They were reminding everyone who still held the power. "I don't know what game you think you're playing," Ella said, her voice low and controlled, "but I'm not going to be intimidated. These people have the right to meet, and you have no authority to stop them." William's expression didn't waver. "I'm just following orders, Mayor." Ella glared at him, her mind racing. The other officers were watching her, their gazes sharp and expectant, waiting to see how she would react. If she pushed too hard, the situation could escalate into something dangerous. But if she backed down, it would send a dangerous signal that the police could act with impunity, even in the face of the ongoing investigation. Before she could decide her next move, a figure emerged from the crowd behind her. Marcus Harrington, one of Brookhaven's most prominent activists, approached with long, determined strides. Tall and commanding, Marcus had been a leading voice in the fight for reform. His face was grim as he stopped in front of Ella. "Mayor Carter," Marcus said, his voice calm but heavy with frustration. "We've got a situation. The people are ready to meet, but the police won't let us in." "I can see that," Ella replied, turning to face him. "I'm trying to handle it." Marcus glanced at the officers, his jaw tightening. "This isn't the first time they've tried to shut us down. But we're not going to be silenced." Ella nodded. She knew Marcus was right. The police weren't here to protect. They were here to stifle the growing calls for accountability. Their presence was a calculated move to maintain control, to intimidate those demanding change. But Ella also knew that any direct confrontation, especially with cameras already starting to gather, could play right into the police's hands. They were waiting for a reason to paint the activists as unruly or dangerous agitators. She couldn't let that happen. "I'll handle this," Ella said quietly to Marcus. "But we need to keep this peaceful. If we escalate, they win." Marcus's eyes flashed with frustration, but after a tense pause, he nodded. "We'll stay peaceful, Mayor, but we're not backing down." Ella turned back to Sergeant William, her expression hardening. "I'm going inside," she said firmly. "And you're not going to stop me." William hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering toward the other officers. There was a brief, almost imperceptible exchange of glances among them, as if they were weighing their options. Then, slowly, William stepped aside. Without another word, Ella walked past him, her head held high. Marcus Harrington followed close behind, his shoulders squared with quiet defiance. Inside the community center, the tension felt just as heavy as it had outside. The room was filled with community members, their faces a mix of anger, determination, and exhaustion. They had come to discuss a way forward, to unite in the fight for justice. But the events outside had only underscored the depth of the challenge ahead. Ella paused for a moment, letting her gaze sweep across the room. These were the people she was fighting for, the ones whose voices had been ignored for too long. The weight of their expectations pressed down on her, but it also fueled her resolve. "Let's get to work," she said, her voice steady. As the meeting began, Ella knew that the road ahead would be fraught with obstacles. The resistance from the police and their allies would only grow stronger. But standing in that room, surrounded by people who refused to give up, Ella felt more certain than ever that they could overcome it, together. Ella took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I know what you're feeling," she began, her voice calm but laced with empathy. "I know you're angry. I am too. What happened out there today, and what's been happening in this town for far too long, is unacceptable." She paused, letting her words settle over the room. The murmurs of agreement were joined by a low current of frustration. Ella pressed on, her tone growing firmer. "But we can't let them win. We can't let them provoke us into something that will derail everything we've worked for. This fight is too important, and we have to be smarter than they expect us to be." The room was quiet for a moment, the tension thick. Then Marcus Harrington stepped forward, his imposing presence commanding attention. His deep voice broke through the silence. "We hear you, Mayor Carter," Marcus said. "But the people are tired of waiting. This investigation is a step, but it's not enough. We need real change. We need to know that things are going to be different." Ella met his gaze, the weight of his words pressing heavily on her shoulders. "You're right, Marcus," she said. "The investigation is only the beginning, but it's a necessary step if we're going to hold people accountable. Change doesn't happen overnight, but I promise you this. I'm committed to making sure we see it through." A woman in the crowd spoke up, her voice trembling with both anger and hope. "We've heard promises before, Mayor. How do we know this time will be different?" Ella turned to face her, her expression earnest. "Because this isn't just about me," she said. "This is about all of us. This isn't a fight I can win alone. I need all of you. Together, we can make sure this moment leads to lasting change. But it's going to take patience, strategy, and unity. If we let ourselves be divided, if we let them see cracks in our resolve, they'll exploit it." The woman nodded slowly, her skepticism softening, though her hope remained guarded. Ella glanced around the room, her gaze meeting those of the people who had placed their trust in her. "We're not just fighting for today," she said, her voice gaining strength. "We're fighting for tomorrow, for the future of Brookhaven. For a town where no one has to live in fear of the people who are supposed to protect them. For a community that values every single one of its members." Marcus stepped closer, his voice quieter now but no less resolute. "We'll stand with you, Mayor. But we need to see action. Words won't be enough." "You will," Ella replied firmly. "We're going to hold those in power accountable. We're going to demand transparency and reform. And we're going to make Brookhaven a town that lives up to its ideals. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but we'll get there." The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement, the initial frustration giving way to a sense of purpose. Ella could feel the tide beginning to turn. This wasn't just a meeting, it was the start of a movement. The people of Brookhaven weren't content to wait for change to come to them. They were ready to demand it. As the meeting moved into planning and discussion, Ella felt a renewed sense of determination. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges: pushback from the police, resistance from the council, and doubt from those who feared change. But in that room, surrounded by the people she had vowed to fight for, Ella knew they had something more powerful than fear: hope. Together, they were ready to build a new future for Brookhaven. A future of justice, equity, and accountability. And Ella Carter was ready to lead the way.